Dave back on headset. Excellent. Looks like that's where the noise is on the television. Microphone here. That's the chicken thing. That's smart.
Please wrap up your conversations and make your way back to the concert hall for the second half of our program. Our next presenter will start in 3 minutes.
Do it or am I standing open?
Our next guest is the Chief Architect of the Building Technologies Office in the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. He is also the author of Retooling the U.S. Housing Industry, How It Got Here, Why It's Broken, and How to Fix It, a book that presents a comprehensive strategy for transforming the new homebuyer consumer experience. Please welcome Sam Rashkin.
Okay, I got the after lunch time slot, always my favorite, so we're good to go. Good napping time, yes sir. Okay, everyone can hear me okay? We're good? So I'm going to speak for 15 minutes before I introduce Gene Myers, and I want to tee up Gene's work, and I'm going to do it by talking about how when we have to get to zero, be sustainable, really leadership is everything. And you know, there's going to be a number of themes that you keep hearing a lot of us repeat over a day like this, and I know you'll notice that. So If the remote works, great. So my only comment about this slide is all the expressions you've been hearing are true. Good planets are hard to come by. There is no planet B. This is where we are. We're not going to take the 8 billion people that we heard that we're just about to reach on this planet and move them to Mars. This is the place we have to make work. And what's really scary about where we are right now is this chart works for almost any environmental factor you want to map up. There'd be some contours and shapes that might add some detail, but essentially that is where we live today on this planet. And what's really scary is the magnitude of the environmental factor metrics and how they're going up and up to levels we've never seen before, uncharted space. And second is the velocity. The speed in which we're accelerating is also uncharted territory. We've never seen the rate of change on this planet for environmental factors. And these various studies tell us that these planetary boundary limits beyond which, if you exceed, the point of return is increasingly difficult or impossible. We have more and more environmental factors that are getting past it. CO2 now is over 400 parts per million, never been there. Biodiversity is decreasing at rates we've never seen. We're losing species almost by the million. Deforestation, our kind of filter for taking carbon out of the atmosphere, is going at unprecedented rates. Biogeochemical flows, a lot of fertilizers and chemicals from there are just destroying all sorts of river systems. And those are already past the planetary boundary conditions. And let's get this to work. And then there's a whole host of other environmental factors that are right at that juncture where they're hitting the planetary boundaries. Atmospheric aerosol, ocean acidification, freshwater use, novel entities of various chemicals that we're putting out there. So essentially, the dead zones in the oceans are at areas we've never seen before. Fresh waters virtually, again, becoming almost an issue that's putting conflict in play. The amount of plastic in those systems and our fish that we eat today, all these things are basically at near crisis mode, if not already past the crisis mode. So here's a beautiful piece of landscape. It evolved over millions and millions of years, and it was lush and beautiful. And then we came along, and in development, in a blip of time, it became this. And this is New York City, obviously, for those that don't recognize it. What it tells you how fast we convert the land to this use is that any solution for the planet and these environmental factors has to involve buildings. There's no other path. And what really makes it urgent is that time's running out. Over the next 35 years, we will be constructing another New York City, all 5 boroughs, every 35 days. That's about 2 trillion square feet every 35 days. It's not like we can do incremental solutions. It's time we have to have transaction-based solutions, complete transformative strategies. There is no more time left. And so any solution must involve buildings too when you look at the profile that buildings pose on the landscape. So they're about 40% of the total energy use. They consume about 75% of electricity. Over 80% of electricity in this country comes from fossil fuels still. So buildings are the only pathway to managing our carbon. On top of that, any solution has to involve the US. We're 4% of the global population, but we account for over 16% of the global emissions of carbon. It has to have a strong central base here in this country. And that moves us to a strategy where we have to look at zero net carbon or zero net energy. And my argument is it has to be inclusive. All buildings have to be achievable for whatever target we set. So that's one of the reasons why I promote Zero Ready in my main job with the DOE. There are a number of reasons I like to do that. First of all, you only get about 50 cents on the dollar for solar on a rooftop versus central utility scale solar or distributed generation solar, microgrid solar. So I'm not a big advocate for mandating that solar has to be on site if you only get 50 cents on the dollar. And that doesn't count all the other complications that happen when you put all that rooftop solar into the grid, make it more difficult to manage and manage with all the cloud cover that comes in or goes away. So Zero Ready is, I think, a solution that's inclusive. And in addition, in cities where you don't have good access to sun for lots of buildings, they can play. In climates that don't have good solar resources, they can play. In sites where you have a lot of shading, those buildings can play. This is totally an inclusive strategy for, I think, how we can do zero. So how do we do that? How do we do this inclusive strategy? The first step is you've got to optimize energy efficient performance. You've got to get it down to the most cost-effective, most efficient level. And so that's about 10 or 20% above the latest codes. Once you've done efficient, then you have to optimize performance. The thing that people don't really talk about that much is how when you make efficient buildings, a lot of risk comes along for the ride. You know, the moisture control becomes much, much more critical because there's no grace period left when buildings are super, super insulated and airtight. The comfort control solutions are much more difficult, and the indoor air quality becomes much more critical when buildings are airtight. We have to optimize performance. It comes along for the ride. And then you want to be solar ready. So if you don't do the zero now, the building is ready to go in case the owners want to do it in the future. And that gives you basically the framework for the Zero Energy Ready Home program. That's basically what we put out there. Very practical approach. And we know where we're going in the future. We know that we have no choice, but buildings have to be resilient if they're going to be persistent. So that's that program where it's going. And that brings me to the fact that the Zero Movement's beginning, whether with that program or other programs. We see it now by just the count by Team Zero is an organization that measures zero activity in the marketplace. There are over 22,000 zero energy or zero energy ready certified homes in the US and Canada. The Zero Energy Ready Home program has over 4,000 homes certified. We have hundreds and hundreds of builders that are building to this level, and commercial construction is coming along as well. We have cities that are doing all sorts of programs like you heard from Santa Fe, San Luis Obispo, and Austin, Texas, that were recognized here. There are many other cities that are implementing zero energy codes. On top of that, the states across the country are also looking to zero energy codes and programs. We all know about California. Oregon has a 2023 code pegged to the Zero Energy Ready Home program. You have other states that are doing stretch codes that look and feel very much like zero programs as well. And then nations, whole nations, particularly around Europe and Asia, are looking to zero energy ready programs and codes as well. So the movement's already in play. And the key thing I want to end on is that it's not like this this environmental reality we're in, where this exponential curve is something that we have to just feel like nothing can be done. Stratozone was in that same situation, and then through leadership and through making global commitments to address the challenge, Stratozone began to drop down and get under control. And we can make a difference when we're facing these crises. So there's a precedence for that. We have the ability to address these planetary challenges. So leadership's everything. And essentially, this is a strategy that I've been working with. There are a plethora of other programs out there that do a wonderful job in this space. I'll mention the group that I'll be working with a little bit the rest of this year once I leave DOE is called Team Zero, and they're going to be a portal for all the programs besides this one. But right now, what I want to talk about is, when I say leadership is everything, I have the opportunity right now to introduce Gene Meyer, who is probably one of the most special zero energy builders I know, that I have the pleasure now also to call a friend. Essentially, what Gene is doing is he's had about 27 years of building in this space. He's been widely recognized among a whole set of programs, including ours. I think he's the most recognized zero energy builder for Zero Ready Home in the country, with more grand awards than anyone I think that we've given the awards to. He's been recognized in Indoor Plus program, and he's also, I have a list of awards he's won. Let me just pull out my, I know he won the Builder of the Year in 2017. On top of that, he was given the National Housing Quality Awards in 2018 and 2019. he's just been recognized tremendously. More importantly, the rest of the industry is watching him. People from globally from other countries like Japan and elsewhere are coming in and looking what he's doing. He's asked to speak all over conferences like this in the country. Even though he's based in Denver, he's a regional builder. He thinks he's a small builder, but he's much more. He's just all over speaking. And maybe the coup of everything he does is just how generous he is. I know I went to one event where he brings all his trades together and how effectively he leverages contributions for a local program that lets inner city kids who don't have any resources go to very special schools and get a really great education. On top of that, he's raised over $100,000 for homes for physically disabled families through Home Aid and Challenge Foundation. You know, you can go on and on about what Gene has done. He's just the most amazing builder, the most amazing manager of a company. He's completely transparent and open with how he manages his business with his employees. He's building a basis for a zero energy company to be incredibly successful and persistent. He's just someone you should listen to. Here's Gene Myers.
I like it a lot better with the lights up because it looks like print. It doesn't seem like a big presentation. Well, one of the things I always start off with is, after an introduction like that, thanks, Sam, we're not experts. And the reason I say that is it's a journey, and we're all on that journey on how are we going to respond with what we do. I happen to be a home builder, and so we're students, we're not experts. And I think that attitude of approaching the challenges that we have with humility and a recognition of just how daunting the task is keeps us well grounded in order to do a good job. So I'm honored to be on the stage with all these great speakers. I'm not sure about Sarah and Ron's judgment in inviting me to be here, but I am happy to share what we've learned over the years. And they told me that right was forward, aimed that way, I guess. So I'm the founder of Thrive Home Builders in Denver. We build a couple hundred houses a year. We're known for affordable housing, for net zero and zero energy ready construction of homes, and for indoor air quality or healthy homes. I'm going to get this right eventually. So there are really three legs to our brand I want to talk to you about: efficient, healthy, and local. Efficient is about energy efficiency for us. And we made the commitment a long time ago to be 100% zero energy ready. And I'm not sure there's a slide on this later, but I'm going to just butt into my own presentation. One of the things we've learned is if you're going to do this, don't do it as an option. Don't leave these energy efficient features or health features up to the customer to choose. First of all, we found it doesn't work because they won't choose it. And second, you don't get to build a brand around it. And so we're very strong. The advice we give all of our peers is dive in and dive in all the way and stick with it. And that's really been our formula. Healthy is the second leg of our brand, and we're adherent to EPA Indoor Air Plus. You'll hear me talk later on in the presentation how much we believe in these independent, verifiable, science-based standards for the way we build. I'm quite sure that if we winged it on any of this, we would end up with a lot of unintended consequences. And we made the decision long ago that we're not going to turn our customers into lab rats. And then local. And we're in a big public company, builder-dominated market, and they can't say local. And so we've grabbed onto that. And later on in my presentation, I'll explain to you why we think that's important. The image up here is of dead trees. And Colorado has millions of acres of dead trees now. I don't think our big national builders understand how we Coloradans grieve when we go up into the forest and see that. And so the question we pose to our customers is, can anything good come from this? And the answer is yes, we can build your house from that. And we can build your house from trees that already died. And we can assist in the regeneration of those watersheds as those millions of acres are reclaimed. We're green, and thanks to Ron and Sarah, they've honored us several times in their publication. I think last year we got an award. This year I got to judge the awards, which was great. And I have to say that some of the buildings in this year's winners are just beautiful. And I'm a firm believer that they can't just be efficient. They have to be beautiful, or our customers won't buy them. And then we're well known as an affordable housing builder. We're the largest builder of for sale affordable housing in Colorado. And so how does this square? How does what I said about making all the things we do a standard feature, and then how do we do it at about half the cost of a median new home price in Denver? And that's what I think maybe we're contributing to the industry, is to learn how to build smaller, simpler, more constructible, beautiful, high-performance homes. Our current product lines, we used to be a predominantly single-family detached builder. It's really more the availability of land in Denver for smaller builders that's driven us to be a majority townhome builder and a minority single-family. So we have 3 projects of townhomes and 2 of single-family. I thought I'd just give you a really quick rundown on the evolution of our product. And Solaris is where it all started for us. Been blessed to be in Stapleton, which is the redevelopment of our old airport, now for about 20 years in one development. And so along the way, we've been asked repeatedly to up our game along with all the other builders. And in 2009, we decided to offer standard solar. And think about that date. Things weren't great in 2009 for anybody in this industry. And we had competitors offering concessions of $50,000 off of houses in Stapleton to get them to move. And our strategy was, let's give them something they can't get anywhere else. And we actually did give it away. That was our concession when we first started offering standard solar back in 2009. As you can see over the years, we evolved that quite a bit and ended up in 2013 with our first grant award for housing innovation from SAM's program, the DOE Zero Energy Ready Home Program. Then Zen was really our first from a clean piece of paper net zero design. And the top one was really Zen 1.0. That was the first of these. And I remember sitting in a hallway of an architectural control review meeting for Stapleton. The door was closed and shouting was happening in there. And I'm getting really intimidated because we really had to keep these houses very functional and simple in order to deliver zero energy. And so the door opens and out walks a big luxury builder in Stapleton with his high-profile California architect, and they're angry. And I'm thinking, great, we're going to walk in there and they're going to cut us to shreds. And so we presented these simple houses and laid it out. And I explained to them that I think these might be the first net zero production built houses that we know of, and would sure like a chance to do them in Stapleton. And they just melted. And we had no comments. Over the years, I will say that some people have called my baby ugly on this, that perhaps they're not the most striking, but you can sure see an awful lot of solar up on that roof. And we sold a lot of Zen 1.0 houses. And the way we describe it is our customer shows up in the model home, falls in love with our house. Oh, by the way, it makes all the energy that it needs over the period of a year. We've evolved this to Zen 2.0, and we're currently occupying the model home down on the bottom picture, and we're in process on yet another revision of Zen. So it's really been a great learning experience and brand builder for us. Our townhomes, I just listed a few of these. Perrins Row was an infill project in a first-ring suburb, the first kind of beachhead of new development that had happened in that first-ring suburb in a long, long time. And we actually went to our infamous double 2x4 wall system on townhomes in this project. We then took our lessons learned at Perrins Row, applied them to a Ridgegate 3-story project that could actually get to net zero. And then our Ridgegate 2-story also got one of the DOE awards. This is our current model of our affordable housing. These are geared to 80% of area median income. As I mentioned before, I think our median new home price in Denver is about $540,000. This house is $215,000. It has a HERS score of 22. It includes a zero-down lease for a small solar array, meets all of our EPA and DORA Plus standards, and these are terrific houses for the people who really need them most. Age-targeted, we dipped our toe in the water with age-targeted product. This is main floor living, so obviously not single-story. Secondary bedrooms are up. And we learned something really interesting about empty nester buyers, which I should be one, and that is people object to going up the stairs to the second floor, but they have no problem going down the stairs to a basement. But that's what our buyers have taught us, and so and this was a very successful project, don't get me wrong, but you just learn some crazy things from your customers. You know, I'll go back. This was, I won't go back. That series was really interesting because in order to have a wide enough plan for a functional main floor bedroom, we couldn't get the density that the developer wanted, the Lowry Redevelopment Authority. So we did a Z-lot plan so that each home had a skinny piece and a wide piece, and the wide piece is what got the main floor bedroom, the master bedroom. It was a really interesting innovation, not just in the way we build and not just at the age targeting, but also at a density move, and yet you still end up with great functional floor plan. Healthy, our Vita series were the first clean sheet of paper designs for health. And you know, as a production builder, we're doing something Sam hates. I don't know if he's still back there, but he hates it when I say that we design based on dollars per HERS point. And he says, well, wait a minute, the HERS software was never designed to be used that way. It's like, well, but how else are we supposed to use it if we're really trying to get the most bang for the buck for our customers? And so with this one, we had rarely taken the leap to balance ventilation, but we felt from a health standpoint, the ERVs were very important. And I don't think I mentioned this earlier, but all of our houses have active radon mitigation just because we're in a really hot radon zone in Denver. I threw this one in because it's just kind of the culmination of a lot of what we've worked on over the years. I went to Stapleton. I said, you know, I have a request. Before this project is done, and we think Stapleton will be about built out in a couple of years, I want one chance to have a segment where we can charge enough for houses that we can do everything that we've learned over our journey. And so they gave us these lots. I called them Panacea, best of all worlds. They're right next to the Rocky Mountain Arsenal Wildlife Refuge, so really close to nature, really close to light rail, net zero, Tesla Powerwall, vehicle charging, just all the bells and whistles that we could come up with. And in addition, a really interesting Panasonic innovation that I think they're launching at the show tomorrow, called Cosmos. We had one of the two first beta versions of that where we monitor indoor air quality on a real-time basis in rooms, and it talks back to the HVAC system and not only says problem, but it manages the HVAC system to get to a solution. And that's really a very rich area of innovation and I think market potential, is to really work hard on the indoor air quality front. So, you know, I put this together and it was sort of a snapshot of, you know, the houses that we built. But I wanted to reflect a little bit more about, well, what have we really accomplished and why isn't it being widely adopted by others? And so I thought, well, I'll just give this example that will open up a new model and our competitors crawl all over it to see what we're doing. But they never really copy it. And so I came up with this bad joke that, well, we can be really open because nobody really wants our company's secrets. And it's not a joke. The problem is that it's not a joke. If this isn't going to be emulated, if it's not going to be imitated, it is not going to grow like it needs to grow in order for the industry to really react to our situation. And so I just thought I'd give you a few slides on why I think that is. Why don't they want our company's secrets? And one is, it's a hard thing to become a high-performance builder. And I use the term pain points because I want to refer back to that term later on in the presentation. It takes people. You need at least one champion. It requires a culture shift of your entire organization, and it's really hard to turn a ship when you're dealing with lots and lots of people that have done it the old way for so long. And so it takes really an approach of shifting the culture in order to become a high-performance builder. You've got to make sure that all of your support people, like raters, and shout out to Steve Byers and Robbie Schwartz from Energy Logic, who really took our hand early on and taught us so much of the building science that we know today. And then it takes a high-performing trade base, which might be the hardest challenge of all. It also involves risk. Can you fund these projects? And we go in early on, I go in and talk to lenders, and they just look at me and go, so why are you doing this? Why do you have to go do something hard? And we have kind of a bad joke in our company. There's a smart way, the easy way, and our way. And of course, that our way implies that there's a right way that isn't necessarily the way it's always been done. And so, but you've got to overcome all of that. What if it doesn't sell? You've got to change the way you sell. What if my home's one of praise, because it should come as a shock to no one in this room that it actually does cost more to build a better house? And what if I promise it to my buyers but fall short on execution? And then finally, can it, oops, I think I didn't get, yeah, there we go. And then finally, it just takes time. And you can't just flip a switch and go from being a code minimum builder to a high performance builder. And one of the things that occurred to me is that period of time may be longer than a typical division president of a public company will even be in this position, because the turnover is so great in those positions or the transfers. It takes persistence, adaptability. You've got to be willing to fail forward because you're not going to get it right on your first houses. And it's just easier to wait for code and let the code make you and your entire ecosystem go for it. So I thought I'd put together just a few lessons from our journey, and we're just a small builder in Denver. And I don't pretend to have all the answers, and yet I think maybe all I can really tell an audience like this is what we've experienced. And so you're stuck with the rest of our journey. I'll just keep going. And I entitled this little piece of the presentation, Winning the Hearts and Minds of your people, your trades, and your customers. And when I think back on all of our accomplishments, I have to say the technological piece has been the easiest. We have the technology. We have the building science. We have great manufacturers where honestly most of the R&D happens in our industry. But what we're missing is winning the hearts and minds of the people necessary to make the shift happen. And this guy right here was a real problem. And I'll explain why. I think it was back in, you can't read this probably, but it's a pretty old study. Back in 2008, IBM did this global study of 1,500 executives, 15 countries, and found that 60% of top-down projects fail. And some of them actually make things worse. And then Gallup did a poll back in 2013, and this isn't on the screen, but their finding was that worldwide, 16% of workers are fully engaged in their jobs. That's 1 in 8. The US and Canada lead the world at 29%. And that's a crazy thing. I mean, less than 1 in 3 people are fully engaged in their jobs. Look around your company. Have you experienced anything like that in your career, or maybe in your current position? But here's the killer. Almost 1 in 5 of them are actively disengaged, trying to undo the progress that the 1 in 3 are trying to accomplish. And so when I was reading through all of this, it occurred to me, well, that means it would be possible for us to have 2 or 3 times the level of engagement of our people than our competitors. And if that were true, would we be a really strong competitor and a force to be reckoned with in our market? The other piece of this was I'd sort of been beating my head against the wall for a long time. And I think sometimes people think I'm really smart. It's taken me a really long time to learn a lot of these lessons. But we would announce a big initiative, and then we'd all have a lot of energy behind it for a little while, and then it would just slowly fizzle, and a recession would hit, or some external event, or worse yet, just the lack of follow-through because of the dailiness of keeping the business running. We just weren't getting results. And so what was embedded in this information I was reading about is, well, it's because I was doing it. And that if we all did it, if we had a company of champions where we're all champions, and we had a culture like that, we would have a much higher likelihood of success. So for years I said, we just got to get everybody on the same page. And so we took it a little bit literally. We have a 1-page business plan. It's the only business plan. There's not a big thick book in the background. It's a 1-page business plan. When we started, it was both sides of 1 page, and we decided that that was just completely too complicated, and that we needed to be on one side of 1 page, and that is the driving document for our company. Why? Because I'd done all kinds of business plans that ended up on a shelf collecting dust that had absolutely no impact. And so what I ask all thrivers is that the 1-page business plan must be on their person at all times when they're at work. And when they're in a meeting, the 1-page business plan is the smartest person in the room. And that we're all subject to our collective decisions about what it is we're trying to accomplish on the business plan. And so for years I had said, well, maybe the reason that we haven't been able to succeed at what we're trying to accomplish is because I just need to populate this business with believers. And somewhere down the line it hit me how hypocritical that is for management to say, well, I just need a bunch of believers in my company, unless top management has taken it upon themselves to build a company worth believing in. And so we set out to line out our purpose, our mission, our mantra, and they all had to be things we could believe in. How's this one? Set a new standard for how home improves life. I can get up in the morning for that. How about be a force for good for our customers, our associates, and our community? Our people can get up in the morning and feel good about going to work to accomplish that. How about always do the right thing? And you know, it's a really tough one, especially when we've hired new people from other builders, because they come in disengaged. Their formula for success has been to keep their heads down and their mouths shut. And then you're telling them, you make the call on the front line, and if you're trying to do the right thing, I'll back you up. And they don't believe me. And it just takes time for people to realize that this is actually true, that we really will back people up. And here's the way I look at it. Sometimes it costs money. But if my job is to follow 48 people around who are just trying to do the right thing, I have a great job. But if I'm following people around that didn't, I hate my job. So this is as much for me as it is for them. We adopted open book management, and this came from the generosity of another builder outside of Nashville who did a presentation at one of these conferences, and just attested to the fact that they had launched open book management at the beginning of the recession and held true to it all the way through the recession. And the guy who gave the presentation was a guy named Keith Porterfield, and I came up to him and I said, how could you tell them how bleak it looked all the way through the recession? And he said, well, I'll tell you this, that when we had to let people go, everyone knew why. And so it's really a call to stop treating employees like children and to respect the fact that they need the facts in order to even manage their own careers and their own jobs and their own lives. And that they are capable of taking in the picture, the whole picture, good and bad. And I have a confession. We were at the EBA conference last fall. It was in Denver. We got a bunch of awards that year. And the week before, we had to do layoffs. And I felt, well, if we're so good, how do I, in a market like this, how do I fail in a way that we actually have to let people go? And I got an email from our director of construction that just said, we're behind you because we know why you did it. And that's why open book management works, is because we teach people what the numbers mean, and we engage them in the life of our company, good and bad, and then we together have to muddle through, and people at least understand what we're doing. We update our one-pager weekly. So there's a section of it for the company goals, department goals, or project goals, and personal goals. And that updating is a way to help connect the dots for our people, that what I do today takes care of the week, which takes care of the month, which takes care of the quarter, which takes care of the year. Otherwise, some annual goal is just too lofty, it's too indirect, it's too abstract for people to act on. But if together in your team you come up with this needs to happen this week, and if it happens, well, the months take care of themselves, the quarters take care of themselves, the years take care of themselves, and that's how we meet our goals. One of the ways we do this is weekly huddle for our small groups. It could be project-based, almost always multidisciplinary, because guess what? Most builders are designed by departments. No single department is really our profit center. Only projects are profit centers. And so we disaggregate the departments and put people into functional groups And then we meet. And how did we do this week? How did I do last week? What do I need to do the following week? And then we have a practice that's become a discipline in our company that after every meeting, we talk about wins and gratitudes. And it's just psychology. We spend all week long solving problems, which is a negative thing to have to do. If all you're doing is focusing on what went wrong, you can become just a real curmudgeon of a builder. And I think maybe the experience of living through the recession, and maybe you guys have experienced it as well, we have so much to be grateful for, even in a bad week. And if we can keep our people's heads up there instead of down with all the problems, we have a totally different environment in our company. And then the Great Huddle, we pull together all of our employees on a monthly basis. We update financials. We go through how we're doing on our plan. We teach financial literacy there. Again, company-wide wins and gratitudes. And here's the cool thing. The wins and gratitudes are almost always for another thriver. And nothing quite builds a team like that. And so it's a little bit messy. That I guess some people say dictatorships are the most efficient form of government. And I'm not saying that we're a democracy by any means, but I am saying that collaboration is messy and it takes time. And there are times when you think you have the right answer, but you just have to get through this process. And then sometimes it's like, wow, maybe that wasn't the right answer. But the bottom line is that 48 minds are better than one. And when we're done, because of the buy-in that happens through open book management and collaboration on goals, we actually accomplish things. I love this line that came out of the Great Game of Business book. For every 2 hands we hire, we get a free brain. If we would just respect that fact. And by the way, the biggest shocks of my career have been when I found out that super quiet person in accounting is actually a leader. Or that really meek person off in planning is an artist. And by respecting these gifts that our people have and engaging them and valuing them and remembering them in our wins and gratitudes, we can draw those out, and it really helps us be better. It's also a better way to live if you're a thriver. The next piece I'll talk about is winning the hearts and minds of our trade partners, and this is a picture of Juan. And I want to tell you this story. We had a trade partner appreciation dinner one time, and one of our plumbers came up. MK Plumbing, my kind of plumbing. That's what that stands for. This plumbing company was founded by this woman's father. It was passed down to her. And she came up to me at the end of one of these dinners, and she just said, "I'd like to have lunch with you." And I naturally go, okay, well, she's got to complain about somebody, but so she shows up for lunch. We go have lunch, and she just said, "I just wanted you to know we fired our last big builder. I can't take the way I'm treated by big builders, and I just want to do more with you." And so that hit me hard. And I thought, well, do we abuse our trades? Is it possible that maybe we're just as bad as the big bad builders? And so I went into our next great huddle, and we were in the jaws of the trade shortage. And we had a project that had bid right about that time, and we bid it out to 15 framers, and we got one bid response. That's how tight the trade shortage was. And so I explained to our people that we're going to deploy our secret weapon, and we're going to beat the trade shortage. And our secret weapon is us. And so we set up this little procedure that when you witness a job well done by one of our crews, thank them. then send an email to their boss, copy me on the email, I'll call the boss, we'll have lunch, I'll tell them that we appreciate you and would like to do more with you, and we'll build these relationships, and we're going to get through this trade shortage. So I get this email praising Juan and Tony from TJ Excavation. And so I do what I said I'd do. I send them an email, love to have lunch. I get nothing. Next week, I ping them again. Okay, my partner and I will come and have lunch. The day comes, and 2 Hispanic guys show up in matching black leather jackets. They are visibly uncomfortable in our lobby. And I can tell that this isn't going to be very chummy. And so, sports. Maybe sports would be a way that I could bridge the gap. So let's go to Elway's. And it's like, oh, no, we can't go to Elway's. Elway's is an expensive steakhouse. And so we settled on pizza. So we have this awkward stroll down to this pizza place. And I asked him, so how many builders do you work with? 1. We had put them in business, and I didn't even know it. Thanks, purchasing, for letting me know. How many employees do you have? 2. And I realized that to have lunch with me, they're not getting paid. And so my script is shot. And I'm like, tell me your story. So Juan has the better English. So he says, well, I apologize for not answering your first email. I have a 6th grade education from Mexico. I'm lucky I can read. I was afraid I would embarrass myself. He came to the U.S. legally. He worked his way up for 20 years with a big basement contractor in Denver that works for the big guys. Ended up the general foreman. Started having stroke symptoms on the job. Drove himself to an emergency room. He was lying on a gurney and said, this job is killing me. And when he recovered, he and his brother-in-law, Tony, started TJ Excavation. He says, I drive a 1999 Chevy Silverado. I live in a mobile home. We bought and paid for all of our equipment in the first year of working with you. They told me that there are legal Mexican construction workers in Denver building houses for themselves in Mexico because they don't want to be where they're not wanted. There was a time when we called Juan's story the American Dream. And I grieve the fact that we have so disabused the people who build our homes that they just want to leave. So now, when I drive around and Tony is on his backhoe, they stop their equipment and they come and talk to me. Word got around it on this story, and I got this call from a woman named Diane Olick, and I didn't know who she was. And Juan and I ended up on CNBC telling this story because it's a story that needs to be heard in our country today. We always remember that the owners of our trades aren't the ones who build our houses. The most popular thing we do is an ice cream truck on a hot day in the summer. And our crews love working for Thrive. How easy is that? We have a trade council, 9 people who come together. They're unpaid. They represent all of our subs. And they problem solve to make our businesses, our relative businesses, succeed. Their first task was to develop a job-ready, job-complete handbook. They wrote a job-ready, job-complete handbook for Thrive. And here's how it works. It's a list of checklists for every trade. And it's like so low-tech. You take the handbook, You tear out your page. The foreman has to fill out this checklist that he's completed his work. He has to sign it. He has to track down our superintendent, look him in the eye, hand it to our super, and say, this job's complete. We did a lean building blitz with True North. And we identified $2.7 million in trade partner savings if everybody did their job right the first time and cleaned up after themselves. And we have pulled 100 days off of our building schedule. And for those of you who are builders out there, a day is precious. We have pulled one. Now, we started at a really high number in the middle of the trade shortage. But together, through collaboration, we have pulled 100 days off of our build cycle. We follow through on what we've learned. And the folks from True North said, we did these comparative surveys of trade partner attitudes towards us in December of 17 and 18, and they said it was the biggest single turnaround they'd witnessed in working with over 75 builders. That's a testimony to our culture, the culture that our people were behind it and our trades were engaged and were working together to make each other better. The next and last piece here is winning the hearts and minds of our customers. And Sarah and Ron have heard me say this, we're actually environmentalists. We just happen to deal in the human environment. And we want our customers to thrive and prosper. Who is our buyer? Sam loves it when I say this. He's back there. He'll probably chuckle. 30, yep. Oh, there he is. 35-year-old woman who drives a Prius, shops at Whole Foods, and has boulder-like tendencies. And anywhere I go in the country, everybody knows what a boulder-like tendency is. And I love this quote from a book, The New Rules of Green Marketing. The green consumer revolution has been led by women aged between 30 and 49 with children and a better than average education, motivated by a desire to keep their loved ones free from harm and to secure their future. We think she's a strong CEO for the family. She's the primary shopper, and she makes buying decisions. She confidently pays more for things that she believes offer superior value and performance. That's really important for a high-performance builder because we have to get paid more than the commodity builders we compete against. As a consummate consumer, she looks for authenticity, honesty, credibility from the brands that she chooses. That's why we have all the labels. That's what the Zero Energy Ready Home label is about for us. That's what the EPA Endura Plus label is, because every builder says, I build a quality house. And our retort to that is, says who? We know some builders that have adopted their own green standard and then brag about how they comply with it. And she loves local. She seeks control, empowerment, and peace of mind by knowing she's done all she can for the people she loves. And when, as a home builder, we can come alongside her and help her on that quest, it's not about granite countertops anymore. We authentically provide credibility with the homes we built, with the labels that we use. We provide an economic case to show that even though the first cost of the home is more, the energy savings can offset all of that, and you really don't pay more to operate your home on a monthly basis than you would just buying a code-built home. We believe that buying a home is fundamentally emotional, and if we only appeal to like a rational basis, we're going to miss the boat. I love this image that there's our 35-year-old woman. There's the one thing she cares about the most in the world. The air she breathes is just as important as the food she eats. We populated our sales force with believers. That's essential. We train them well. We use great models to reinforce that emotional decision of buying. And our sales office messages are really targeted at making sure people understand this is a meaningful decision. That is a stack of $20 bills that adds up to $106,000. That's how much money we'll save our customers over the life of owning this home. What will you do with the savings? So we're the low-cost producer of homes that no one else has. Our homes will help pay for their energy, make you healthier, and will give you the peace of mind of knowing that you've done all you can for the people you love. In order to mainstream more sustainable housing, we really need to deal with these pain points, and I'll quickly go through these last slides. There's so many good training resources out there, and I want to put a plug in for the Energy and Environmental Building Alliance. EBA is curating these in a way that will make it easier for builders to take advantage of the training. Almost all of our field people are EBA certified with EBA Site Supervisor or EBA Certified Builder certifications. We love the way that our successes in high-performance building are highlighted, and Sam's been a real pioneer in this with his Housing Innovation Awards. And then we're starting up at EBA Builder Benchmark Group, which is a community of mutually supportive builders, to do financial metric benchmarking on the premise that we get better homes and more homes built if the businesses who are building them are successful. So to deliver sustainability to mainstream housing, my most important message is don't go it alone. Use the proven third-party and unparalleled building science and market support behind the programs, and join the high-performance builder community. Learn from the journeys of others. Plug into the best practices to build great businesses that we need to build great houses. After all, we're willing and enthusiastic about sharing our company's secrets. Thank you.
Our next presenter might be the most influential person you've never heard of. Rihanna Gunn Wright is the policy director for New Consensus and was one of the co-authors of the Green New Deal. A 2013 Rhodes Scholar, Ms. Gunn Wright worked as the policy analyst for the Detroit Health Department, the Miriam K. Chamberlain Fellow of Women in Public Policy at the Institute for Women's Policy Research, and also worked on the policy team for former First Lady Michelle Obama. Ladies and gentlemen, Rihanna Gunn Wright.
Sorry. Hi. Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here. And honestly, you all are the real MVPs. When I think that you all are going to listen to me for approximately the same length of a Real Housewives episode on a holiday where you don't have to work, truly, it is a miracle. So thank you for this. I'm very excited to be here. Apologies in advance. I'm getting over strep throat. I'm no longer contagious. I'm taking my penicillin. So no worries if you talk to me afterwards, but it does mean that I'm gonna sound like this and occasionally maybe get lost because I'm still a little lightheaded. But again, it's really exciting to be here, and it feels really fitting to be here today on MLK Day talking to you all about sustainability and equity, because my experience of our built environment, and I say our because I do truly believe that, particularly in this country, we are knit together. This is our space, it's our environment. And so my experience of our environment was very shaped by who I was, and really who I am as a young Black woman. So that is a picture of baby me with my mom and my grandmother. It was, I think, my birthday. That was my first bike. It was a Barbie bike. I've always been a diva. And so I grew up on the south side of Chicago with my mom and my grandmother. I grew up in the same house that my mom grew up in, and a house that at this point my family has owned for almost 70 years. But the environment that I grew up in was different, really different from the environment that my mom grew up in. So when my mom would tell me stories about growing up in the same house on the same block, they were really vibrant stories that sounded a little bit like Leave It to Beaver meets Good Times. It was a lot, but it was just stories about a bustling like business strip that they all used to go to grocery shop and buy clothes. Kids on the street riding their bikes all day, playing together. I don't know if you can see, but in the background on the left, there's an abandoned lot. And she would tell stories about my uncles playing stickball and the time that my uncle really didn't want to lose, and so he gave all the kids chocolates that were really laxatives so that his team won. And that was her childhood. Even though, I mean, it was Chicago, so there was still segregation, right? There were streets that they could not cross. My uncle crossed the wrong street once and tells this story of how he rode his bike like he had never ridden his bike before because he was gonna get jumped. And that was the world that they lived in, and the world that I lived in felt completely opposite in a lot of ways. Segregation was over. I could cross any street that I wanted, in theory, around my neighborhood, but the truth was that by the time I was born in '89, drugs had already come in. The sort of where you could go was already patterned by where the gangs were. By the time I could like go to the park by myself, the park was a place for drug deals. So we couldn't go there anymore. And so my experience of my built environment was both one of growth, right? I could go anywhere, but in actuality, it was really bounded. It was really limited. And I still remember the 3 times when I got to ride a bike, not that bike, I had outgrown that bike by then, but I got to ride a bike with my cousins past the end of the block. I got to do that 3 times in my childhood. And that was just the way it was. I didn't really think about it a lot until my family moved when I was in college. They moved to a suburb, and I still remember that first summer when I came home from college. I was, at the new house, and I must have looked really crazy to the neighbors because I was 20, and I would just ride my bike around, sometimes in circles, like not going anywhere, because it was the first time in my life I had ever felt that kind of freedom. I didn't know, oh my gosh, I'm getting emotional. Sorry, guys, it's MLK Day, it's fine. But I had never felt that way before. I felt like I was flying, and I remember when I was writing this talk, how sad I felt for that little girl because she didn't get to do that. And that was the first time I really, I think, understood what our built environment tells us, because it communicates. It tells us both what you're allowed and also what other people think about you. And I had grown up in a place that very clearly communicated to me and all the people that I lived with that even though we loved each other fiercely, even though my neighbor picked up trash every day around because she really believed that seeing trash made you feel like trash, even with that, we were just surrounded by a lot of nothing, which made it seem like we were nothing. And, um, and that's really hard. And then moving somewhere and seeing that, like, that's not the normal. You can live in places, there are built environments that tell you, communicate that you are worth something. And that there's something out there for you, even if it's just a bike ride, just a breath of fresh air, that you deserve that. And so that's one of the reasons why I was really excited to come here, because it seems like you all are some of the people that are really on the cusp of thinking about the ways that our environment shapes us, the ways that it tells us who we are and what other people think we deserve. And the fact is that now, in the midst of a changing climate, our built environments do that and even more, because our built environment is in some ways actively killing us, and some of us quicker than others. And so this is 8th Street. How many of you have been to DC before? Oh, I forgot who I'm talking to. All of you. So this is 8th Street. Have you ever been to 8th Street Northeast? Okay, so yeah, so 8th Street is where I lived in DC for most of the times that I lived in DC. And when I used to see this picture before I worked on the Green New Deal, I just saw a street where I used to live, right? The first street near my first apartment, and you know, the walk to the train station or whatever. But now, when I first started working on the Green New Deal, when I saw this photo, all I would think about was carbon, right? Those buildings, there's embodied carbon. We burn fossil fuels to power those buildings. Those cars burn fossil fuels. The streets made of concrete, all of it, right? All I would see is carbon. And then that was before sort of the next stage of thinking, because I'll be honest, when we first started the Green New Deal, we didn't think a ton about land use. We were thinking really strictly industrial policy. What are supply chains? What is decarbonization? All of that. And so sort of the next phase, because something I don't think a lot of people realize is that the Green New Deal is it's a movement. It is sort of a living, breathing thing. And so there are phases. And so we quickly learned that we were short-sighted in not thinking about land use. And so then sort of in the second phase, when I would look at this, I would start thinking about design and land use. So is this part of an urban planning design that increases car use? Is it safe to bike or walk on the street? Are these bus lines, are these the green buses that the city has, right? Do they run these routes, or are these diesel buses that run these routes? Because this is close to a poor neighborhood. It used to be. Now if you go back, there's like 3 PetSmarts on the street or something. It's wild. So those were the things I was thinking about. And the fact is that even that is too small. Even that is still thinking about this built environment in the midst of a vacuum, because the fact is that DC, like everywhere else, is in the middle of a really rapidly changing climate. And so, have you all heard of the 2100 project? Probably not, but it is essentially a gigantic mapping project. It's called the Atlas for the Green New Deal. It was put together by the McHarg Center at the University of Pennsylvania. I encourage you to look at it. It has really interesting visualizations of some really great data. And so this is their map of environmental risks. So these are the environmental risks that will face different areas of the country through the end of the century. And so you see there's like earthquakes, there's wildfires, there's floods, there's hurricanes. So all of that is happening in the midst of the environments that we have now. And so if you go, so this is their map of sea level rise. So DC is along those coasts, so the more intense the red, the higher the sea level rise, essentially. And I'd say I'm showing you all of this because now the questions about the built environment, we're not talking just about design or land use or even carbon. We are talking about a whole new constellation of questions. right? Because now, if I was to go back to that photo of H Street, now what I'm thinking about is H Street part of an urban heat island, right? As temperatures rise, will this area essentially cook its residents? And if we are trying to deal with all of that in the midst of, transportation and land use and design, what about the emissions from the buses? Are they contributing, but don't we need more public transit, right? How do we balance walkability and all these factors, reducing car usage with the fact that temperatures are rising, and will it be safe for people to be outside, right? And so I bring all this up because these are the kinds of questions that I think you all face all the time. And these are the kinds of questions that we have to ask when we're talking about a built environment in general in the context of a G&D or not, but just a built environment in a changing climate. Like, these are the kind of multi-layered challenges that we have to face. And I say that because I feel like sometimes it's hard to grasp how many layers we're dealing with every time we're trying to solve a single problem. And I just think that even though it's hard, it's really important to just sit with that and recognize that, like, if you are in fact facing all of these layers of questions, you're not doing something wrong. Because I think sometimes the impetus is, if it's getting more complicated, you must just be complicating it. But the fact is, it's just complicated. Period. Which brings me to the slide about mortality. So this is climate change, mortality based on climate change projections. I think this is through 2099. I think the period that this captures might be 2080 to 2099. But the important part is to just look at the shape of what's happening. I'm sorry that the bottom is messed up, but essentially red means an increase in mortality. The more intense the red, the higher the increase in mortality. Blue is reductions in mortality. But I think it's really important to look at this in context with the next slide, which is national income distribution. So the places that are orange and the more are places that are more impoverished, and the more intense the orange, the more impoverished they are. And I think it's just important to notice how the maps overlap. A lot of the places that are facing the highest sort of mortality risks are the same places where these are already some of the poorest parts of our country. And this is due in no small part, right? The link is due in no small part to the built environment, right? These are places that have decaying infrastructure, old dilapidated housing stock, high energy costs because of energy inefficiency. Their inability to bear the changes of climate have everything to do with the fact that they are poor. And the fact that they are poor has everything to do with the type of people who live there, who often look like me. Right? And so I think that this is important because we've talked about layers, right? The layer of climate, the layer of design, the layer of decarbonization, but the layer of equity is never not there. This is the background to all of the policy that we create. It doesn't go away. There is no technocratic solution that will make this go away anytime within, before we do anything about it. And so I wanted to back up because I think this brings me back to one of the central questions of this conference, which, if I'm understanding it correctly, is about how equity and sustainability, equity in the built environment, how those are linked, and why equity has to be part of our response to the climate crisis. And I always like to tackle this head on because it's almost a year since the Green New Deal resolution came out, and people still ask me regularly, why does equity have to be part of this? Right? Why can't we just deal with climate? Why do you have to deal with income inequality and try to redress historical inequities? Why do we have to do all of this? And the fact is that it's because there's no such thing as just dealing with climate change. that doesn't exist. A colleague of mine, Jedediah Purdy, likes to talk about the society being a body, right? And energy, the energy we use right now, fossil fuels, that's the food that we take, right? Our built environment, in a lot of ways, it's our bones, right? And when we change our or when we change our energy source, we change fundamentally the way that our body works and the ways that it has to work, right? It has to evolve. And so how many of you all have ever gone like vegetarian or paleo or vegan? I mean, it's January, so everybody, right? And how many of you, kept up with it for like longer than a month? I can't put my hand up because I never. And did your body change? Did you notice ways that your body changed? Whether it was having more energy or whatnot. And that's because your body had to change. You were giving it something different. And society isn't any different, right? When we change our energy source, we're going to change our body partially out of necessity. Because if you don't change when your source of fuel changes, you're inefficient, right? Like you're on your way to decay because you cannot adapt to what is now the new normal. And I decided to come out here and talk to you all because, sneak attack, I don't usually do talks this long. I don't know why anyone wants to listen to another human being for an hour, just why? But I decided to do this because you all in this room sit at a really crucial intersection of these changes. You literally sit at the intersection between the change in our economy and the changes in our built environment. And those are really essential. Because when we're talking about the change in our economy, it's really easy to think about it in very macro terms. But the fact is that, like, when I'm talking about a change in our economy, to me, I'm talking about the fact that renewable energy is going to fundamentally change a bunch of business models. Utility business models, right? Business models around just like operation of things. Renewables, the real cost is installation. It's not necessarily operating, right? You're talking about distributed energy. You're talking about going from a grid that is just a one-way flow to two-way flows, right? You're talking about fundamentally changing a lot of the fundamental business models in our economy. You're also talking about changing production centers, right? Because no longer do you have to be near fossil fuel rich places, right? Where you install things changes, right? It's about where is there a lot of capacity for solar or wind, or we've pretty much tapped out hydro, but possibly hydro, right? All of that changes, and that's gonna change migration patterns, which also changes an economy. And then of course you have ideally really swift changes in demand where fossil fuels go from being the default to low carbon being the default. So all of these are, I think, really fertile changes that we still don't know exactly how they'll play out and exactly how they'll change things, but we do know that that's what's gonna happen. And at the same time, you're talking about, along with these changes in the economy, really deep changes in our built environment, right? We need new infrastructure, new EV charging stations, new hydrogen fuel cell charging stations, solar arrays. You need new materials to build that infrastructure, new low carbon materials, new land use, new planning. All of this is happening and they're really deeply intertwined. And so in some ways, I'm really jealous because I think you all have some of the coolest jobs going forward, because the way that we shape our built environment, not only does it have to support these changes, it can facilitate and accelerate them if we do them right. And so and I'm just talking about the changes that we have to make carbon-wise, but we saw the map of mortality and income distribution. So the fact is that we still have to decide what are the changes that we want to make. What is the kind of world that we actually want to build? Because there is what we have to do in order to deal with decarbonization, and people define that differently, right? And so it still remains that we have to decide what kind of world we want to build along with what has to happen. And we have to also define what has to happen, because that's not set in stone either. And so, sorry. So this is a map from that same atlas, and it's called The History of Big Ideas. And it maps some of the large-scale planning initiatives, all publicly funded, that the U.S. has undertaken over our history. And I really like this map because I think in the midst of what is like very understandable overwhelm, it's really exciting to be able to see on a map that we have chosen the world that we want to build. There are times that we have done that very intentionally. And you can actually see that and visualize that on the map. And it's really, I think, as terrifying as it is, it's also exciting because we get to do that again in a way that I think is bigger than any of us imagine possibly in our lifetimes. And so when we are thinking about how to decarbonize, we also have choices in front of us. Like, America has less social infrastructure than we've ever had before, right? Fewer communal public spaces than we've ever had before. And we can rebuild that if we want. We can have things like community energy generation, green spaces, rec centers, local food systems. We can have those, right? And in a lot of ways, it makes sense to have those because they help us transition to a world without fossil fuels. But the question is, do we want to include them, and for who, right? Because the fact is, all of those things, as much as we need them and as much as they connect, we are still facing a political situation where unless you can say, hey, this is only about carbon, people will ask you why. Why do we need to do this extra stuff? And so I think it's really important to stop and recognize that we can have those things, even when people tell you that you can't. If you're gonna have to rebuild anyway, we get to choose. But the question still remains, what's the kind of world that we want to build? And again, because we never leave this background, the question is, who do we want to build those things for? Who do we want to get to use them? And so I know I keep saying this, but I want to pause on this because in the work that I do, and I think the work that a lot of you do, it's really, and just living in the world that we live in this moment in world history and American history, it is really easy to see nothing in front of us but immense suffering and not a whole lot of ways out of it. I mean, Australia is still burning. There are bushfires now. I recently saw a video of a koala who was burnt and wailing. And I will never forget that. Right now, as we speak, there are armed men marching on Virginia's Capitol on MLK Day. Today. About gun control, but I think we all know it's not about gun control. You could have done that Tuesday if it was about gun control. But this is the world that we live in, and it feels like it's all so much often. But when I was writing this talk and thinking about the sort of things that you all get to think about and what we can design for our future, I just wanted to stop and recognize that, like, it's a really paltry miracle, right? It's a really tiny blessing, but what a blessing still, no matter how tiny, to be in a moment where we so clearly get to decide the kind of society we want to live in and carry into the future instead of feeling trapped in the society that we have. You don't get that all the time, you know? And, oh, thanks. But truly, you don't get that all the time, right? My great-grandmother was a washerwoman in Mississippi. She didn't get to choose the society she wanted to live in. She lived in the one she got. I get to stand at this podium and, low-key beg you all to build green, to consider equity as a 30-year-old black woman. Miracles, as tiny as they are, do happen. And so I just wanted to pause on that because I think it is important to remember also that we are going to be someone's ancestor someday. So we truly need to take the ability, this moment seriously where we get to choose and really think deeply about what do we want to choose and what do we want to create for the people that come behind us. Because in some ways we really are immortal. Okay, that's enough Marianne Williamson for you. So back to economic transformation. So let's back up to the basics, which is what do we actually need to do to transform our economy? I'm going to say transform our economy approximately 35 times during this talk. And at some point you'll probably be like, what does that even mean? And the fact is it means a lot of things, but at its base level it means that we have to do two things. We need to build and produce a lot more low carbon stuff. We just don't have enough stuff. And then we also have to redesign our systems. In this talk, we're talking about the built environment, but of course, if you follow the Green New Deal, we talk about having to change economic systems. We have to talk, something that we don't talk about a lot, but we need to talk about more is the fact that we have to change our political systems, all of these sorts of things. But the fact is we still do have to redesign our systems to support a fossil-free future. And so that's essentially what the G&D is trying to do. We're really aiming at two things, redesigning systems and building a lot of stuff. And it's really exciting because even though we've not done these things in this context, we have done these things before. So I don't know if you can see it, but on this map is the Tennessee Valley Authority. I'm going to show you my terrible grasp of geography right now. And the Tennessee Valley Authority was part of the New Deal, which was one of the biggest mobilizations where we tried to transform the economy in U.S. history. So this is the Norris Dam that was built in the New Deal as part of the TVA. And I like to talk about the New Deal for a couple of reasons. The first is that it was a response to both the Great Depression and some people don't realize the Dust Bowl. So much like we face today, which is an ecological and an economic crisis, the New Deal was a response to also ecological crisis and an economic crisis. The other reason that I talk about it is, again, like today, I think you can think about the New Deal as a mobilization that had to be undertaken because one economic model, so the capitalism that came out of the Industrial Revolution, had reached excess. It had gotten out of control. And it had, in doing so, crashed the economy. And similar to what the Green New Deal is, which is partially a response to the excesses of neoliberal capitalism that have led to limitless extraction, right? To limitless burning of fossil fuels, so the things that have led us to the climate crisis. But I think it's important to realize that in the New Deal, I think the really important part for this talk is that the New Deal was not what we usually think of as an economic mobilization in the sense that it wasn't industrial. We didn't actually produce more stuff. Truly, the New Deal was an economic mobilization that tried to work through infrastructure and design. It was a large-scale infrastructure program. And so it does leave some lessons about what we have to do now, the ways that we have to think about rebuilding and redesigning our built environment, what we did before, how we did it before, the mechanisms that we use to do that. Now, if you're talking about an industrial economic mobilization, a mobilization where we truly stepped up our ability to create stuff, that is World War II. So this is a Chrysler factory in Detroit. I just moved to DC from Detroit, so what up, doe? But this was a Chrysler factory that was converted to produce tanks. Because when the US got into World War II, we didn't have the capacity to build basically most of what we needed to build. So before entering the war in 1941, the US produced roughly 2,500 aircraft a year, 0.3 million tons of merchant ships, and less than 100 tanks. That was what we had the capacity to build. And by the end of the war, we produced approximately 550,000 aircraft, 88,000 tanks, and at least 18 million tons of merchant ships. That was a 4-year mobilization. We built that kind of capacity in 4 years. And that was just like artillery and weaponry. We also learned how to make component materials, so basically invented and learned how to produce at a mass scale synthetic rubber. During World War II, we also increased the amount of magnesium and aluminum production anywhere from 7 times to 288 times the pre-war average. And the way that we did this, we did a lot of things. It was deeply a public-private partnership, but a big, really important part of it was public investment. So the US government spent $20 billion, and this is in 1945 dollars, about 10% of defense spending on facilities and machinery, literally just building the capacity to make stuff. And in fact, the federal government spent about, of all the money that was spent on this sort of stuff, they spent about 2/3. And so this is a table from one of my favorite books. If you want to learn about World War II history and making stuff, it's called Destructive Creation. But this is a table of the amount of public and private financing that went into the 25 largest plants that were operating during World War II. And if you'll notice, basically the public sector spent all the money. But in the end, this helped grow the economy in part because when the war was over, the government turned around and sold those facilities to private industry for pennies on the dollar, which, depending on who you ask, was a bad or a good decision, but either way, people benefited. And what's even more is that both, if you're talking about economic gains, both of these mobilizations help grow the economy, right? There's actually a really big question about whether we could have mobilized in World War II the way that we did if we hadn't done the infrastructure spending in the New Deal, right? If we hadn't expanded the amount of energy that was available throughout this country, if we could have done what we did. And beyond that, it was great for workers because when you have economic mobilizations, it tightens the labor market, right? It compresses the income distribution. So it actually reduces income inequality, it drives up wages, and it disproportionately benefits workers who are at the bottom of the income scale. So the New Deal produced about 15.5 million jobs over the course of the New Deal. And World War II at the peak, unemployment went from, I think, 13% before the war, and at its lowest it was 0.4% during the mobilization. So if you're talking about how to jumpstart an economy, we kind of know how to do that in a lot of ways. But I think it's important to take a step back, considering that we're talking about equity today, because it's really easy to look at these examples and say, great, we did it, we just do this again. All we have to do is harness our ingenuity and have big ideas and do big things again, and that's true. But the fact is that both of these mobilizations failed a lot of people, right? World War II, the GI Bill, provided wonderful home loans. The rates were incredibly low. To veterans, 98% of those home loans went to white people. Those are the reasons that we have suburbia now, right? In some very real ways, and it's also part of the reason that we have the type of redlining that we have now. The New Deal created so many of the social structures, social policies that we still rely on, including Social Security. It was designed to exclude agricultural workers and domestic workers, the majority of whom were black at the time, and it didn't include them for 15 years. That is 15 years of foregone wealth, right? And the thing that's important, I think, to remember about all that is that those legacies reverberate. That is 15 years that my grandmother or great-grandmother, who was a washerwoman, could not save for retirement, right? My grandfather was a veteran in the Korean War. Same GI Bill, did not get a home loan. He thought it was because he was too prideful. My family always talks about he's too prideful to go ask for that sort of handout. It didn't matter if he would either way, because they wouldn't have given it to him, right? And to this day, my family and lots of families, millions of families across the nation deal with and live in the legacies of those decisions. And that's why it's really important to recognize that all of this mobilization, it happens in the context of the political economy, the society that we have now, and that is a political economy that's always been rife with inequity and fragmentation. And neither of these mobilizations attempted to change that political economy. In fact, particularly with the New Deal, the exploitation, right? Our political economy is built on the exploitation, economic, social, political, of certain groups of people, the desire to keep them and use the means of the state to keep them as cheap labor. And the New Deal did that. It upheld that political economy. World War II did it less so, but nevertheless did it. And so the fact is that no matter how strong these mobilizations were, there's always a weakness in the core of your society and in the core of your economy when some people are, the state is designed to keep them in a particular place, right? And so it is imperative that as we go into this next economic mobilization that the Green New Deal is calling for, that we think about how we are engaging in our political economy, because equity does not happen by accident. If you put water down a hill that is sloped, the water will run down the hill. It will not distribute equally. And so we have to be honest that there is no sort of just dealing with climate change outside of our political economy, because if we truly want to bring about a more just and equitable society, then whatever we do in terms of how we are going to mobilize to address climate change has to face down our political economy and make some decisions about the kind of political economy that we want, because policy follows power. And the way that we distribute money, the way that we distribute power, and the transition away from fossil fuels will decide the political economy that we have when we get to our carbon-free world, right? And so if we have an economy that is as stratified as this, so this is just a graph from EPI. You've probably seen similar graphs about income inequality and the growth and whatnot. But essentially, if we have an economy that still looks like this, even if we have somehow decarbonized, which I don't know how we would do that at the same time, but say we did it, we still will have failed, I think, in some really fundamental ways. And so that just leaves us with the question of what do we do? How do we create a just and equitable green economy and a built environment that not only reflects that, but helps bring that justice about? And so I think it means that we have to grapple with a couple of facts. The first is that climate change and equity are linked, right? In very real ways. So studies continually find that countries with higher levels of income inequality, especially rich countries, have higher emissions, and that doesn't disappear just when you have something like density, right? Because a lot of people will talk about density as an answer to this, but a colleague of mine, Daniel Aldana Cohen, again at UPenn, he's done some research in New York and found that even in that city with its incredible density, a lot of the emissions are still driven by higher income people who have a much larger carbon footprint. And we're not sure of the mechanisms, but we do know that there's something there. We do know that somehow inequality is helping to drive up emissions. And even if the exact mechanisms aren't clear, what we do know is that fossil fuel industries depend on the existence of disposable communities to exist. Because when you burn fossil fuels, you essentially poison people, which means that you have to have a place where you can poison people, and their response, their outcry, can be ignored in lots of ways. That is a fundamental part of a fossil fuel business model. And so as long as there's inequity, there's always a chance for that to happen. And the other thing I think we have to grapple with is that incremental solutions aren't going to cut it. And that's really difficult, I think, in this moment to grasp, because the state of, I think, being a human a lot is that inaction leads to more of the same. If you don't do anything, everything stays the same, right? But we're in a moment where inaction actually leads to like a deep and really rapid unraveling of the world around us, especially for our economy. And so this is another map from the Atlas. I just love the Atlas. And it's total economic effects based on climate change projections. And the sort of darker that brown color is, the more loss there is. And so by 2099, 76% of counties in the US will experience economic damage because of climate change, right? And even if you look at the maps of shore level rise or environmental risk or mortality, what you actually see, which I think is the most frightening part of these maps, is that whole parts of the country become kind of unlivable, right? You lose a lot of your coast. A lot of the southernmost states will be so hot, right? That workers who work outside in places like Texas will be in deep danger. And so we're talking about not just sort of economic loss in terms of dollars, but the amount of productive, in a lot of ways, productive land shrinking, right? So that we go from this large country to essentially having to live huddled in only parts of our nation. And so I think it's just important to recognize, because this is what happens if we don't do anything, right? It's not more of the same, it's worse. And similarly, if you look at, these are the temperature increases, right? And so by 2099, near where I live in Maryland, it'll have the temperature of Mississippi. Our infrastructure, our built environment is not prepared to deal with these changes. When I think about Detroit, Detroit's median income is about $23,000. It is one of the poorest cities in the nation. Detroit is going to get hotter, and even when it gets hot in the summer now, it's a problem. But people can't afford air conditioners, and there aren't cooling centers. What happens? Right? What happens? And all of this is without considering that we have a population boom on the way. So by 2060, the US population is projected to grow approximately 100 million people, similar to the baby boom, right? And so these are some of the slides, again, from the Atlas about what's necessary. And this is just what's necessary to sustain the next 100 million people. So we're talking about like billions of solar panels. We're talking about almost 200,000 billion gallons of irrigated water. We're talking about an incredible amount of storage capacity that's needed. And this is without, that population booms without factoring in climate refugees, right? So this is what we're facing, and also because it's MLK Day, and I can't go without talking about white supremacy, we also have these dudes controlling the response, right? And so it feels like a huge mess, a really staggering mess. But again, going back to what I was talking about, I think the wildest part of all this is that with all of this going on and all that we're facing, the question isn't, can we get out of this mess? It's how will we get out of this mess? And I'm not just saying that because we have to, because apocalypse. I'm also saying it because if we were only able to get into this situation because we were smart enough to create these problems, or dumb enough, depending on how you think about it. But the fact is, we created corporations, right? We created these systems. There is nothing that is causing these problems that we haven't designed, which means that we have the capacity to redesign it. Truly. And I like to linger on that because, especially, you know, it's MLK Day, we're thinking about how he fought for a better country, but I'm often shocked by how many people will come up to me and just be like, we'll never get climate action because of Mitch McConnell. And I'm like, you would rather face down Mother Nature, who is 5-0 in the extinction game, by the way, she has never lost, and versus the filibuster? That's the enemy that you want to choose? And it's always really wild to me because part of what feels like happened over since the Reagan era, maybe longer, is that we have there's so little faith in what we can do. I'm just amazed that today we can think about MLK and all of his struggle, or we can talk about how the founding fathers did what they did, and we act as though we can't design anything. If they could do that, why can't we do that? And I will just put a pin in this, you know, all of us are a little bit smarter than Thomas Jefferson, because do you believe in slavery? No? Great, you're a little bit smarter. You know, so you're much better equipped. And so this is, even though it's a mess, the fact is that we can do these things. So much is possible if we do the work that is necessary. And so what is the work that's necessary? So this is the place where I'm gonna start talking about policy specifics and sound very smart. I know this is the part that you've been waiting for, so you're welcome. So HR 109, how many people have read, it's often called the Green New Deal Resolution. The official name is House Resolution 109. How many people have read the Green New Deal Resolution? Okay, I'd encourage you to read it. It's 14 pages. The font is really big and there's a lot of spacing, so it's truly not even 14 pages. But it includes 6 goals related to the built environment and transportation. So it's building resiliency against climate change related disasters, largely by leveraging funding and providing investment for community-defined projects, upgrading and repairing infrastructure, meeting 100% of the power demand in the US through clean and renewable sources, upgrading all existing buildings in the United States, and building new buildings to achieve maximum energy efficiency, water efficiency, safety, it goes on, overhauling transportation systems in the US to remove pollution and greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector, and cleaning up hazardous waste and abandoned sites. So I often just like to think about it as resiliency, infrastructure, transportation, so on. And these are the things that the resolution says. Of course, if you read the resolution, it doesn't say how we will do these things, because the truth is, when that resolution went out, when we started developing the Green New Deal, and even now, we don't know how we'll do these things. And I don't say that to be flippant, it's because no one knows. We don't know. And I like to emphasize that because I so often I'll see papers that'll sort of not say here's 5 things we can do, but they sound very assured of themselves. But the fact is that No one has faced a challenge on this scale before. We really haven't, in quite the same way. And we can talk about models and projections, but none of those represent reality accurately. There is an element of this where we simply don't know the world that's coming, so we don't know exactly what we need to do. But when we released the G&D and when we started working on it, we took a bet that even if we didn't know, even if no single person knew, that together, if we came together, we could figure it out. Because enough people know enough stuff, right? That if we can work together, we can figure out how to do this. In part because, like I said, we're building a world. This isn't a test. There's no one correct answer. There's lots of paths that we can go down that will lead us to the place that we want to go. And so that is what is happening in the G&D now. That's the phase of the G&D that we are in right now and have been in. I would say probably, in some sense for the last year, but really intensely, I think over the last 6 months. And what we do know, even if we don't know exactly how it will go down, we know that it's going to require research, it's going to require regulation, market development, financing and investment, and new programs and services. And all of these things actually need to align and coordinate, which is why you want a mobilization often, because it allows a greater amount of alignment and coordination than is what's allowed in other sort of responses. And so in terms of research, so like a couple of things. So one of the first things that I truly believe we need is a taxonomy of buildings. We are talking about upgrading all homes and buildings in the US. We have something like 180 million homes in the US. They vary widely in how they're designed, they vary by region, and we don't have any of that data centrally. So it's very difficult to plan how you will actually upgrade all these homes, how you might be able to do it in the most efficient ways, unless we have a taxonomy, unless we actually take some time and figure out what do the buildings look like, what do we actually need to do, and how do we update them on a mass scale. And of course, for transportation, we're also talking about transit systems for different types of areas. Right, there's the public transit options that you need for a rural area are different than an urban area, right? The ways that you support accessible transit can be very different, and we actually need to do some real thinking about not only what are the sort of different transit systems that we need, and some people have started doing that thinking, but it's hard to find still, and also ways to plan, just like we kicked off suburbanization in the post-war era. I think it's time to think about what are the new ways that we want to plan communities to reduce energy expenditure, to reduce the vehicle miles traveled. Because I don't always know if we can do that right now, because people are not super jazzed about being like, we're gonna redesign your home, the one you live in right now, your whole neighborhood right now. But that doesn't mean that we can't start to make changes and plan for the future. In terms of regulation, I mean, there's so many things that you can do. One of the first things, I remember talking to an Obama alum who had helped write the Recovery and Reinvestment Act, and we were like, how do we get people to do what we want to do? Like, is it tax incentives? Is it you know, do we nudge people? He was like, just tell them what they can and cannot do. We try, you know, because he was like, we don't have time for incentives. We tried that, and I think there are places for incentives, but there are places for a kind of regulation that we haven't been comfortable with for a long time, which is, you know, regulation. There's questions about, should we just outright phase out internal combustion engine vehicles by a particular date, right? Instead of all of these, you can build this until this part of the market share, maybe you just say by 2040 we don't use those anymore. Done. Right? There's other regulations. Building codes are largely local, but do we want to issue federal guidance and targets to support state and local policies requiring new construction to be zero carbon, right? Increasing the air quality, indoor air quality that is reasonable so that we can help kick out natural gas out of homes, right? There's legislation like NYC's climate mobilization plan that already requires all new buildings to be built with either green roofs or solar arrays, right? So regulations are happening. The question is, how do we want to use them? Excuse me, do we want to set emission standards for existing buildings? Do we want to halt new gas infrastructure build out? So a regulation can do a lot. Regulation is about, you can both nudge, but it's really about setting up the guardrail, saying what is possible and what isn't, so that we can have clear markers for what is another part of this, which is market development, right? And so market development, some of the things that we think about a lot is what's the role of federal procurement, right? The federal government builds and buys a lot of stuff, right? And so how do you use federal procurement to increase demand and to stabilize markets for low carbon goods, especially ones that are nascent, like cross-laminated timber or prefabricated retrofits, or even just solar panels, right? And also market development, how do we tie building codes so that key trigger events, like when a building is bought or renovated or replaced, it triggers basically things that you have to do in order to upgrade that building, right? Is that one way that we can get all buildings upgraded? Financing and investment, you're talking about things like a climate bank, right, that provides access to capital for building upgrades, for deployment and implementation. You're talking about direct public investment a la World War II in nascent industries. You're talking about using ARPA-E to fund research into clean fuels and electrification for heavy-duty transit. Those are all things that we can do, and of course, new programs and services you're talking about, are we gonna upgrade homes and buildings through a federal program or a partnership with states? Are we gonna have new grant programs to replace the low or no emission vehicle program? Are we gonna have new on-bill financing so that people can install solar into their homes? All of those things are all in play, and there's solutions out there that I haven't mentioned and solutions that we haven't come up with yet. And all of those are necessary for us to do the things we need to do to transform our economy and our built environment. And so what I'll leave you with last is that it's important not just to ask what we will do, but how we will do it. Because again, equity is just as much a matter of what we do as how we do it. Who gets these jobs? How much do they pay? What's the quality of these jobs? Do people have access to the qualifications that they need? So all of these have to be supported by just and equitable social programs, systems, and workforce development to make these things the ways that they need to do. And we also need to talk about new models of ownership, particularly community ownership and local ownership. And so I'm gonna leave you with this quote, because it was MLK Day, so I can't, if BP gets to quote Martin Luther King, I do. And the quote is simple: capitalism forgets that life is social, and the kingdom of brotherhood is found neither in the thesis of communism nor the antithesis of capitalism, but in a higher synthesis. Because ultimately, this is what the Green New Deal is about. It's not about a far left response. It's really, truly not even about our politics. It's about people. It's about recognizing that contrary to what we've been told, our actions are not just the result of ourselves, right? Our environments do shape us, our settings do shape us, and policy has a big role in shaping the settings that we all grow up in. And we're heading into an increasingly, even under the best estimates, we're heading into an increasingly resource-constrained society, or into an increasingly resource-constrained world, in a society that is soaked constantly in scarcity. We have to get everything that we want off the market, right? It is us, it is you alone out there, but in a place where things will actually become more scarce. We need a setting that gives us the space to be generous and kind and empathetic, because that's what we're going to need to get through this transition, and that's what we're going to need to face an uncertain world without devolving into, I think, the kind of chaos that is just knocking outside of our door always these days. And the Green New Deal is fundamentally about creating that world, about creating a set of background conditions that actually allow us to live as the best of ourselves and show that to other people in ways that I think we are not able to now. And you all are really crucial to that, and so I hope that you will help us figure out how we do this and how we actually create a future that MLK would be proud of, but more importantly, that you are proud of. So thank you.
We're going to take a short break for refreshments and networking. Refreshments are once again located in the lobby. We will resume the program right here in the concert hall at the bottom of the hour. Please make sure to make your way back by 3:30. You're not going to want to miss our last two speakers of the day.
I'll fix it.